Hi, everybody. My name's Trinity Wells, and this is my midterm discussion for Human Service 3603, otherwise known as Brain and Behavior. For my midterm discussion, I chose to focus on my habit of overworking myself, which is something that I'm so bad about doing. Um, for context, as long as I've been old enough to work, I've always had at least a job, and then as soon as I got out of high school and I was allowed, I've had two. For context, at the current moment, I am working three jobs and I am also a full time student virtually. So, as anyone can expect, that's a very, very insane workload and is very detrimental to my physical health. Um, Initially, when I started developing this habit, it was more so of a coping mechanism to avoid thinking about the trauma I was experiencing because it allowed me to escape the trauma physically that I was in, but it also allowed me to escape the thoughts and be busy enough that I just never really had time to think about it. Over time, I have, of course, kind of healed from this and I have really progressed as an adult. I no longer am dealing with any of the stuff that I was before and the trauma, but um it's become the behavior of it all has become so automatic that I now feel lazy or like I'm not doing enough if I slow down or I'm not productively using my time in a way that benefits me financially, career wise, or, I can't really say emotionally because I'm impacted negatively emotionally with my habit. Um, this is important to mention because it has led to burnout. I don't sleep a lot. I undereat because I'm just so busy. I have chronic fatigue and I am just always in a state of stress or I'm in a state of fatigue. Which is why I kind of chose to address this habit for this semester because it's honestly detrimental to my health that if I don't deal with it on my own now, my body's going to force me to at some point and it's going to be worse on my mental health and I kind of know it. Um from a neuroscience perspective, this habit has shifted into my basal ganglia more so than my prefrontal cortex at the beginning due to how long I've been engaging in it. This means that it's become automatic rather than something I consciously choose. Um, Whereas breaking it kind of when breaking this habit, it requires re-engaging my prefrontal cortex again. Now, this seems very complicated, but for a little bit of context to what I mean by disengaging my prefrontal cortex, when you first consciously make a decision, your prefrontal cortex here, which is your decision and goal planning, um, engages to actively make the decision to do that thing. Your brain always seeks to be the most efficient that it can be in the best way that it can be. So when it receives the reaction, such as dopamine, which I will further explain later, it will shift it to the basal ganglia when it's experienced enough to make it more efficient and more automatic. So it just is like a cog, wheels in a cog, and just how it shifts so it's smooth and it runs and it gets what it desires. Um, to break a habit, you have to re-engage the prefrontal cortex and make the decision no longer subconscious but conscious again, which is extremely difficult. Um, and this is just because your prefrontal cortex has everything to do with your decision making habits and your self control. To do this, I've actually been intentionally replacing overworking with healthier habits. Like, I try to spend more time with friends and actually make plans that I go to that are low stress. I force myself to take some time off work, whether it's to bed rot, which most people would say is horrible, to just sit at home and watch TV or do whatever, but it's very low cortisol and allows me to just kind of exist for a little bit. And I also am allowing myself to get like low stress hobbies that anything that cannot shoot up my cortisol as much as I am because it's helping interrupt the automatic response and encourages neuroplasticity by forming new patterns. This is easier than how people describe smoking, quitting cold turkey, because it gives your brain something to shift into the pathways and the responses that it's used to, and in turn override those habits as the time goes on. Um, Research kind of supports this by explaining that habits are not simply erased, but are instead replaced through repetition and reinforcement within neurological feedback loops, and this heavily depends on dopamine. Dopamine is a huge role in the process of communicating to each section of your brain, like the basal ganglia and your prefrontal cortex, and it is the leading drive into what habits are repeated, the lack of better words, repeated, and which ones aren't, because it wants, as I said before, that dopamine rush every time. Um, when I first began overworking, my brain associated that feeling of relief from the stress and avoidance of trauma and got a dopamine rush every time that I did it. So it felt rewarded by the act of working all the time and not thinking about it, which in turn made me subconsciously start repeatedly seeking it out. Over time, of course, my brain optimizes this process so that overworking became the default way to achieve that dopamine response, reinforcing that habit further, even if it doesn't benefit me in the way that it did when I was younger, because it's not the same anymore. This is why breaking the habit is so difficult, because I have to consciously override an automatic system by activating my prefrontal cortex instead of allowing my basal ganglia to run my behavior of overworking on autopilot. Additionally, it is very important to mention and consider in all of this that I do suffer from OCD. I have undiagnosed for most of my life, but diagnosed for a couple of years. Um, and I know a lot of people think OCD is just a wanting your room clean or being a freak about certain stuff like that, but it is so much more deep rooted in the processes of habits and what feels rewarding to our brain, because no matter what I do, the goalpost just gets further and further, and it never really feels fully rewarding to me when I achieve it. Um, this having OCD is important in retrospect to this all because it intensifies the process. Research, which I will have in written out in this discussion post, um, shows that individuals with OCD often experience reduced goal directed control and stronger habit based behaviors, making it way harder to override automatic responses. Um, and this is just because when you suffer from OCD, your brain will not only do you have the repetition of the habit, as I've said since I was 16, but your brain also has a weakened goal directed control, which essentially means that you have less of it is much harder and less control over what your brain is automating, because it's just going to go with what's most efficient and what makes it feel the most safe. Most people that suffer from OCD obviously suffer from it due to trauma. Some people just have it in childhood, but mine is directly correlated with the trauma that I've experienced as a coping mechanism, which explains why it's hard for me to not overwork myself. This also makes it harder for my brain to recognize that a habit is no longer beneficial for me. It still sees it as it was helpful at one point, so it is just always helpful, instead of recognizing that the damage it is doing is overweighing the benefits now, at this current point in my life. Overall, this habit that I have of overworking was developed through a combination of coping, reinforcing it, and my brain neurologically adapting and the neuroplasticity of it. And rather than trying to eliminate it completely, I'm working to replace it with healthier behaviors to help it evolve over time instead of absolutely tanking my mental health to just quit it. Um, and yeah, that's really it. The brain is really complicated in the way that it does it, but I think with my approach to override it with healthier habits has definitely helped a lot. Like, I started picking up things such as just building Legos, which seems stupid and childish to an extent, but because it's so low cortisol, I can kind of just let my brain do whatever it wants while I do it. It is proven to be very, very beneficial in progressively adjusting me off of overworking to, in turn, break the habit and give my body a break and my mind a break because Lord knows I need it. And yeah, this is my midterm video and assignment for brain and behavior. Thanks.